There's a particular kind of silence that fills the mountains just after dawn, when even the birds seem to pause, waiting for the sun to push its first golden line across the tops of the ponderosa pines. It's in that quiet, so pure it rings in her ears, that Clara Dawson breathes in her new life for the first time. The air is sharper here, laced with the wild, resinous scent of spruce and the lingering chill of last night's frost. For a fleeting second, she almost feels free. Then her mind circles back, like it always does, to fire and ash. The ranger outpost in the deep Montana woods is so remote the nearest neighbor is a ghost. Just the ruins of a sawmill, lost to time. Somewhere past the next ridge, the cabin creaks when the wind picks up, the boards settling like old bones. Clara chose it for its isolation. After everything, solitude isn't just a preference. It's the only thing that makes sense. The forest, with its endless green, shadows, and unbroken hush, is the only place she feels she can breathe without apology. She stands at the edge of the porch, boots sinking into frost-stiff moss, and surveys the world that is supposed to help her forget. A river, still veiled in morning mist, splits the valley below. The mountains rear up on every side, impossibly ancient, indifferent to her grief or her need for escape. There is no one here to ask her questions, no one to see her flinch when she hears the distant pop of a branch snapping, like a firework, too close to home. She presses her thumb against the cool metal of an old compass. It fits into her palm, as if it's always belonged there, even though it was never really hers. Her brother Mark carried it everywhere, a battered family relic, a joke between them. And so you don't get lost in your own backyard, Clara Bear? When the fire took the house and took Mark with it, the compass was the only thing that survived. Sometimes she imagines it's warm from his touch. Other times it feels like a weight she'll never put down. Most mornings she wakes up gasping, half certain she still smells smoke. The dreams always start the same, a low crackle, heat blooming across the floorboards, Yetta, Mark shouting her name. She can never quite reach him. Sometimes in the gray half-light, she thinks she sees him standing in the shadows at the edge of the tree line, face unreadable, silent. By the time she's fully awake, she's alone again, except for the compass, always clenched in her fist. The outpost is both sanctuary and exile. Clara is good at her job, monitoring wildlife, logging weather data, keeping the drone system operational. She writes careful reports, files them on time, and avoids personal calls from headquarters. The staff back in Missoula assumes she's simply quiet, a little odd, but solid, reliable. Exactly the kind of person you want stationed alone in the wilderness. No one knows about the nightmares or the trembling in her hands the first time she drove past the scar of an old forest burn, blackened trunks marching to the horizon. Solitude doesn't heal. It just makes the ache manageable, like learning to breathe shallow so your ribs don't hurt. On her third day, she finds herself drawn to the edge of the property, where a narrow game trail disappears into the thicket. She's not supposed to wander far. Protocol says to check in hourly, especially with wildfire risk high in late summer, but she can't resist. Something about the hush beyond the outpost's cleared boundary tugs at her, promising relief, or at least a different kind of pain. The forest is thicker here, sunlight mottled by layers of needles. Every step sends birds fluttering ahead, squirrels chittering from high branches. She moves quietly, instinctively scanning for signs. Broken twigs. A patch of fur caught on a low branch. The faint imprint of hooves in mud. It's the kind of attention she's always had, hypervigilance. Her old therapist called it, now honed into a skill. She finds a downed log and sits, knees hugged to her chest, and listens. It's so quiet she can hear her own breath, ragged and uneven. There's no rush. Nothing demands her attention but the rhythm of the woods. She pulls out her brother's compass, running her finger over the engraved initials, and lets her mind wander to old memories, camping trips, muddy shoes, Mark laughing as they tried to roast marshmallows in the rain. He always said the forest was a place where you could start over as many times as you needed. She wonders if that's still true. A sudden crackle, The unmistakable snap of something large moving through brush pulls her from her thoughts. She tenses, every muscle on alert. The shape is hard to see at first, just a ripple in the undergrowth, shadows shifting. Then, with a grace that seems impossible for such a big animal, a deer steps into view, nose twitching. It pauses, staring at her, ears flicking. For a moment, they regard each other across the clearing, both uncertain but unafraid. Clara feels her heartbeat slow. For the first time in what feels like years, she isn't afraid to be seen. The deer flicks its tail and disappears into the trees, soundless as a ghost. She sits there, long after it's gone, soaking in the ordinary miracle of the encounter. When she finally rises, the sun has climbed high, scattering diamonds on the wet grass. She wipes her eyes, not sure if she's crying or just overwhelmed by the beauty. Back at the outpost, she logs her notes, drinks bitter instant coffee, and stares at the forest through the rain-streaked glass. She wonders what Mark would say if he could see her now, half wild, stubborn, clinging to the edges of her own life. Maybe he'd tell her to get out there, to look for something worth staying for. Maybe he'd just laugh, toss her the compass, and say, "You're not lost, Clara. Not really." But most of the time, she just sits and waits for the silence to work its slow magic, for the ache to dull. She waits for something to break the spell. A sign, a voice, a miracle. She doesn't believe in any of it, but out here, anything feels possible. And that, maybe, is enough for now. The days in Montana have a way of stretching, long and slow, filled with the kind of quiet that magnifies every sound and stirs old memories you thought you'd buried for good. For Clara, the work is a comfort. Each morning, she falls into a routine, checking the drone batteries, scanning the forest for signs of smoke, and reviewing the memory cards for wildlife activity. She keeps her distance from the outside world, but here, she can track every heartbeat of the forest, every shift in the wind. It's early September when she first sees them, not in person, but as pixelated shapes on the flickering monitor in the ranger's office. The outpost is outfitted with a new conservation drone system, a recent grant meant to help spot wildfires early and monitor the fragile Mustang herds rumored to roam these mountains. Most of the footage is forgettable: deer grazing, an occasional bear, a coyote slinking through the brush. But on this particular afternoon, as Clara fast-forwards through the previous night's aerial sweep, something makes her pause. There, moving through a meadow streaked with wildflowers and patches of fading snow, is a herd of wild Mustangs. They are beautiful, even through the grainy black and white filter, powerful, wary, perfectly at home in the open. They move like shadows across the earth, their bodies slick and shining under the rising sun. At the edge of the group, half hidden behind the bulk of a larger mare, is a colt unlike any she's ever seen. A silver gray, with a mane that tumbles wild across its eyes, and legs almost too long for its frame. Its eyes, deep and startlingly dark, flick toward the drone's lens as if it knows it's being watched. Clara leans forward, eyes straining for detail, as the colt darts behind the herd's matriarch, a striking mare with a patch of white down her nose and the fierce look of an old survivor. The matriarch moves between the drone and the rest of the herd, protective, unyielding. It's a small moment, but Clara feels something shift inside her, a stirring, a flicker of fascination that she hasn't felt since before the fire. The next morning, Clara gathers her field gear and sets out on foot. She's careful to follow protocols, logging her location and making sure her radio stays on channel. But really, she's following a pull she can't explain, a need to see the Mustangs with her own eyes. The air is still sharp with autumn, a warning that snow is never far away in these mountains. Every step is deliberate, her boots crunching on the brittle grass, her breath puffing out in little clouds. She moves quietly, sticking to the cover of the trees as she approaches the area where the herd was last seen on the drone footage. The forest here feels older, wilder, pines towering overhead, their needles muffling the sound of her movement. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker hammers at a dead limb, the rhythm echoing across the valley. Clara pauses, listening, letting the sounds settle around her. She's learned to move in the forest's pace, to be patient, to let curiosity replace the anxiety that so often dogs her steps. Hours pass, the sun rising and dipping behind a patchwork of clouds. Just as she's about to give up and turn back, she catches sight of movement at the far end of a clearing. Horses, half a dozen at least, their coats flashing in the sunlight as they graze, snort, and shift restlessly. Clara crouches low, her heart pounding, and raises her binoculars. She finds the matriarch first, standing at the herd's edge, muscles tense, eyes alert. The other horses defer to her, giving her space, moving only when she moves. The silver-gray colt is there too, never straying far from the matriarch's side. It's skittish, prancing a little, shaking its head when the wind lifts its mane. Clara can see the intelligence in its gaze, the curiosity mingled with caution. She stays perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The Mustangs are close enough that she can hear the soft rustle of their movements, the occasional whicker or snort. The matriarch flicks her ears toward Clara's hiding place, and for a moment it feels as though time itself holds its breath. The two lock eyes, woman and horse, each measuring the other, each searching for threat or promise. Clara lowers her binoculars, keeping her hands visible, non-threatening. She's read about encounters like this in old ranger journals, how trust is built, not with force or clever tricks, but with patience and respect. She resists the urge to move closer, to break the spell. Instead, she sits in the moss and lets the moment linger, imprinting every detail on her memory. The dappled sunlight on the colt's back, the powerful sweep of the matriarch's neck, the wild, beautiful order of their world. Hours drift by, the herd grazes, occasionally raising their heads to sniff the wind or shift positions. Clara sketches quietly in her notebook, rough outlines of horses and the shapes of their movement. She notes how the matriarch keeps herself between the colt and anything unknown, how the younger horses shadow her every step. She wonders if they, too, have lost someone, if this is a herd shaped by grief and survival, just like her. As the afternoon light fades and the forest grows cool, the herd begins to move off, slipping into the deeper shadows with the same effortless grace. The silver-gray colt glances back once, its eyes meeting Clara's, then disappears after its family. Clara remains seated long after they've gone, heart still racing, hands trembling with a feeling she can't quite name. Back at the outpost, she reviews her sketches and the drone footage again, searching for details she might have missed. The fascination grows into something deeper. In a quiet session, she begins tracking the herd's movements, plotting their routes on her map, learning to recognize the signs of their passage. A tuft of gray hair caught on a branch, hoofprints pressed deep into the mud beside a creek. She sets rules for herself. She won't interfere, won't try to touch or feed them, no matter how strong the temptation. She's here to observe, not control. But every time she catches sight of the Mustangs, every time the silver colt's eyes meet hers, she feels the wall around her heart loosen. Just a little. Clara doesn't know what will come of this connection, if anything at all. But for the first time in a long time, she feels a purpose that isn't tied to pain or memory. Out here, in the silence of the wild, something old and wounded inside her begins at last to stir. A week slips by in a hush of falling leaves and gray skies. Autumn in Montana comes all at once, the first hard frost leaving a silver crust on the world, the trees dropping gold coins that carpet the forest floor. Clara grows more attuned to the rhythms of this place. How the pines moan when the wind turns fierce, how the river's voice deepens after a night of rain, how dusk falls sudden and absolute, swallowing all color until only the wild shapes of night remain. Routine is Clara's armor. She wakes early, checks the radio, logs weather patterns, sets the drone on its dawn patrol. She's growing skilled at interpreting the drone's jittery footage, reading animal trails like a secret script. The Mustang herd is becoming a puzzle she's determined to solve. Each day, she notes fresh evidence. Flattened grass, glimmers of movement between birch trunks, distant silhouettes at the water's edge. The silver-gray colt and the matriarch, always together, always a little out of reach. The ache in her chest is softer now, less like a wound and more like a bruise. She finds comfort in watching the herd from afar, in filling her notebook with sketches and careful notes. Sometimes, in the silent spaces between her tasks, she thinks she feels her brother's presence. A flicker at her shoulder, a warmth in her palm where the old compass rests. But these are just echoes, she tells herself. Grief playing tricks in the long silence. One afternoon, dark clouds tumble in from the west, threatening rain. Clara weighs her options. Return to the outpost, or risk another trek deeper into the forest to check the old fire break lines. She chooses the latter. Anything to keep moving, to keep the restless thoughts at bay. The trail narrows and climbs. Pines gather close overhead, their needles whispering secrets as she passes. The air grows colder, thick with the metallic scent of coming rain. Somewhere high above, a raven scolds her passage. Clara's boots slip once, then twice, on slick roots. But she presses on, following a vague memory of a logging cabin marked on an ancient ranger map. Thunder grumbles. In minutes, the sky splits open and rain comes down in sheets, so sudden and fierce it blinds her. Clara curses, yanking her hood up, squinting through the torrent for shelter. Trees blur together, their black trunks shining, and just as panic claws at her, reminding her of another time, another storm, she stumbles upon a shape half swallowed by brambles. It's the cabin. The roof sags, one window gaping, but the door holds. She ducks inside, slamming it behind her, breath ragged in the sudden hush. The air smells of damp wood and long-dead fire. Shadows crowd the corners. She stands still, listening to the rain drum on the roof, heart pounding from more than the climb. She runs her hand along the wall, searching for a lamp or switch out of old habit. Her fingers find something strange, rough, raised lines. She squints and sees, just above eye level, a series of charcoal sketches smeared across the wood, horses drawn with swift, passionate strokes, Mustangs running, rearing, locked in flight or battle. The artist was no amateur. The sketches capture movement, panic, freedom, grace. Clara stares, transfixed. Someone else long ago saw what she sees now. Someone else tried to trap the wildness of these woods on paper. For a moment she forgets the storm entirely. She follows the sequence of images, horses leaping fallen logs, a colt pressed close to a larger mare, smoke curling up in the background of one drawing. Her chest tightens. Fire. Again. Always fire. A memory tugs at her. Mark, sprawled on their living room floor, drawing elaborate battle scenes on the backs of old grocery lists. He'd once scrawled a mural on her bedroom wall, horses racing under a burning sky, just before their parents painted over it. She closes her eyes, breathing deep, letting the damp air and the scent of charcoal ground her in the present. She sits on a dusty cot by the window, pulling her knees to her chest. Outside rain slashes the clearing. The wind howls through broken shingles. Clara hugs the compass to her chest, cold metal biting into her skin. She's suddenly exhausted, wrung out by the storm and the memories. Without meaning to, she drifts into sleep. The dream is so vivid she wakes gasping, nails digging into her palm. Fire again. Always fire. But this time it isn't a house. It's the forest itself, ablaze. Flames licking up pine trunks, smoke blotting out the sun. Horses scream, trapped by fallen trees and burning brush. The silver-gray colt runs in circles, searching for escape. Clara shouts, but her voice is lost in the roar. She sees Mark, standing on the far side of the flames, calling to her, his face hidden by smoke. She tries to run to him, but her feet won't move. Heat presses against her, suffocating. She bolts upright, breath sawing in and out, sweat cold on her brow. The storm has passed. Faint sunlight leaks through the cracks in the walls. The silence presses in, as heavy as the dark before dawn. Oh, Clara rubs her face, trying to steady her heartbeat. Her hands tremble as she pulls out her sketchbook, flipping to a blank page. She draws blindly, letting her mind spill onto paper. Flames? Horses, a girl running, a compass spinning wildly. When she finally looks down, the page is a mess. Raw lines, blurred by tears she refuses to acknowledge. She stands, shaking, and crosses to the wall. The old charcoal sketches seem to watch her, silent witnesses to pain and hope. She traces one image with her finger, the matriarch, standing between the fire and her herd. Fierce, unbroken. Clara leaves a page from her own sketchbook on the table. A crude drawing of the silver colt, staring boldly back at the world. It's a thank you, an offering to whoever lived here before, to the ghosts that share the forest. Maybe, she thinks, pain isn't just something you survive. Maybe it's something you share, passing it down like a talisman until it grows lighter in the telling. She shoulders her pack and steps back out into the world, the air washed clean and bright. The pines gleam in the sun. Somewhere, a horse whinnies, a distant, wild sound. Clara starts walking, her boots steady, her breath calmer now. She doesn't know what waits beyond the next ridge. But for the first time, she's willing to find out. Some wounds heal so slowly, you can hardly see the change until one day you realize the ache has faded, even if only a little. For Clara, every day out here seems to stretch and contract. Her grief sometimes so loud she can't breathe, other times dulled by the ordinary miracles of the forest. There's a rhythm to her solitude now. Morning checks, drone flights, careful observation, always keeping herself busy, always listening for the call of hooves, or the sudden hush that means something wild is near. Ever since that stormy afternoon in the abandoned cabin, she's carried a new sense of purpose, mingled with the old pain. The sketches on the wall, the dream of fire and horses, it lingers in her, reshaping her understanding of the land and her own scars. The Mustang herd, especially the silver-gray colt, has become a quiet obsession, a living mystery that keeps her moving forward. She decides, tentatively at first, to try a new approach, no longer content to observe only from the lens of a drone or the safety of distance. Clara begins taking her sketch pad into the field. The first time, her hands shake so badly she can hardly draw a line, and the herd keeps its usual wary distance, clustered tightly around the matriarch. But each day she returns, settling herself on a fallen log or a mossy rock, never closer than the herd will tolerate, never making a sound that might startle them. Time, in the forest, feels different. The days are punctuated by simple, small victories, the wind shifting, carrying her scent away, a bird landing close by, the matriarch glancing in her direction, then looking away. Satisfied she's no threat, Clara sketches, quick and light. Letting her pencil move with the rhythm of the horses, she draws the play of muscle under the matriarch's coat, the curious tilt of the colt's head, the way the younger Mustangs mimic their elders. At first, the herd grazes with their backs to her, heads lifting at every sound. But Clara learns patience, learns to breathe with the woods, to slow her movements until she seems more shadow than woman. She remembers advice from her brother's old field notes. Patience is its own kind of language. Animals notice the patterns in your presence, the honesty of your stillness. She talks to Mark sometimes, in a low whisper, imagining he can hear her, imagining her words slip past the trees and ride in the wind to wherever he is. Over the course of weeks, the dynamic subtly shifts. The matriarch stops moving the herd away when Clara appears, though she never lets the silver colt stray too far. The other horses begin to accept her presence, if not with trust, at least with tolerance. There are moments when a young mare, bolder than the rest, edges a little closer, snorting and pawing at the ground before darting away. Clara marks each of these encounters in her notebook, a catalog of the slow unspooling of suspicion. One afternoon, the sky a hazy watercolor of gold and blue, Clara finds a spot beneath a twisted pine where the wind smells of resin and distant rain. She sits quietly, knees drawn up, and opens her sketch pad. The herd is closer than ever, less than 50 yards away, the matriarch standing like a sentry, her mane rippling in the breeze. Clara loses herself in the act of drawing, lines coming easier, confidence growing with every page. It happens almost by accident. She's so absorbed in shading the curve of the colt's neck that she doesn't notice it moving. When she glances up, the silver colt is several paces closer, ears pricked forward, eyes wide and watchful. For a heartbeat, neither of them moves. Clara feels her breath catch, the world narrowing to just this moment, the colt's dark eyes, the nervous quiver of its flank, her own heart drumming a frantic beat in her chest. Slowly, she lowers her pencil, her hands open and relaxed. She whispers, not to the colt exactly, but to the space between them. "Hey there, I see you." The words are simple, but their weight is enormous. For weeks, she's spoken to the horses as if speaking to herself, words for Mark, for the ghosts of the forest, for the aching spaces left behind by fire. The colt takes another tentative step, then stops, glancing back at the matriarch. The older mare doesn't move. But Clara sees the flicker of tension in her posture, a warning but not a threat. She knows better than to push. She sits perfectly still, letting the moment breathe. After several minutes, the colt snorts softly, stomps its hoof, and then, in a blur of movement, bolts back to the safety of the herd. Clara lets out a shaky laugh, her hands trembling with adrenaline and awe. It's nothing and everything. The first crack in the wall between their worlds. That evening, back at the outpost, Clara studies her sketches. She tears the page with the silver colt, her best work yet, and on a sudden impulse decides to leave it as a silent offering. The next morning, she hikes back to the same tree where she'd sat, carefully pinning the sketch to the rough bark with a twig. It feels like a ritual, a way of saying thank you for the trust she's been given, however slight. She lingers nearby, hidden in the undergrowth, watching as the herd drifts into the clearing. The matriarch notices the paper first, snuffling at the tree. The colt approaches, curiosity overcoming caution, and noses the drawing before losing interest and trotting after its protector. Clara smiles, a warmth blooming in her chest that surprises her. Days pass, and the pattern continues. Clara brings her sketch pad, always respectful, always watchful. Sometimes the herd ignores her entirely. Other times, the silver colt draws near, sniffing the air, testing the boundaries of its own fear. Each encounter feels like a tiny miracle, fragile and easily broken. But trust, Clara realizes, isn't a single moment. It's the patient accumulation of countless small risks. She finds herself healing in ways she never expected. The act of watching the herd, of being present without demanding anything in return, slowly stitches together the broken places inside her. She talks to Mark less often, not because she's forgotten him, but because the forest has given her other voices, other stories. She learns to carry her grief without letting it define her. And so, the days shorten, the leaves turn, and the cold deepens. But for Clara, the forest is no longer a place to hide. It's a place to begin again, one slow, fragile step at a time. Clara had grown so used to her quiet rhythm, the solitary hours, the slow trust with the Mustangs, the small victories that stitched her days together, that she almost forgot how easily peace can be shattered. The forest, it seemed, was always waiting for a disturbance. A sudden storm, a fallen tree, the shadow of a predator slipping through the underbrush. She just didn't expect the disruption to arrive on four wheels, grinning behind a pair of mirrored sunglasses, looking as out of place as a coyote at a tea party. It was barely dawn when the engine's growl echoed up the valley, scattering the deer and sending a flock of startled magpies wheeling into the sky. Clara, out by the storage shed sorting drone batteries, straightened and squinted through the low mist as a battered government-issued SUV bounced down the dirt track toward the outpost. The vehicle slewed to a halt, spraying gravel and mud. The driver's door swung open, and a man hopped out, tall and lean, with a shock of blonde hair and a tan that didn't come from the Montana sun. He had a clipboard under one arm, and a restless, hungry energy that made Clara instantly wary. His boots were brand new. His jacket was too clean, but his smile was effortless, almost practiced. "Hey there. You must be Dawson. Dr. Shane Corbin?" he announced, striding over and offering a hand before she could even say hello. Wildlife Science, UC Davis. I'm your new research partner for the next few months. Didn't get my email? Clara hesitated, caught off guard. She shook his hand, the grip firm, and managed a polite nod. No one told me we'd have visitors this season. I thought I was the only one on the grant detail. He flashed another smile, running a hand through his hair. Paperwork got shuffled. You know how it is. Headquarters wanted fresh eyes on the Mustang project, and they thought my collar was due for a little Montana dirt. He chuckled like they were already old friends. So, where's the coffee? Clara tried not to bristle, but the intrusion felt like an insult. Her outpost, her forest, now had a stranger in it, and not just any stranger. Corbin carried himself with a casual confidence, an undercurrent of impatience humming beneath his friendliness. He moved quickly, poking his head into the office, asking about the drone tech, ignoring her careful organization as he rummaged through the supply cabinet. He talked as if filling silence was a competition. Stories about his fieldwork in Arizona, about grants and academic politics, about tracking bighorn sheep and capturing mountain lions for tagging. He was smart, Clara couldn't deny that, but he was also reckless, and his questions about the Mustang herd were sharp-edged, focused on control and data collection, rather than respect and observation. That morning, as they reviewed drone footage together, Corbin was openly impatient. You're telling me you haven't tried tagging in the gray colt, not even a simple tracker? He tapped the screen where the silver colt darted through the meadow behind the matriarch. We could learn so much about their movement patterns, their range. These animals are a goldmine of data, Dawson. Clara set her jaw, shaking her head. They're wild for a reason. Stressing them out with tranquilizers just to stick a tag on them isn't worth the risk. You tag one, you might spook the whole herd. They might never come back. Corbin rolled his eyes. Not unkindly, but dismissive. Come on, you can't get sentimental out here. Science has to move forward. That's what we're paid for. He leaned in, lowering his voice. Look, I know you've been out here alone for a while. Maybe you get attached. But we have a responsibility to get results. Their uneasy partnership took shape over the next days. Corbin was all action and ambition, always pushing, always wanting to do more, faster. He set up new cameras, peppered Clara with questions, stayed up late drafting proposals and requests for expedited sample collection. He made calls on the satellite phone, lobbying headquarters for more resources, complaining about the slow pace of fieldwork. But what grated most was his disregard for the rules of trust Clara had worked so hard to build, not just with the Mustangs, but with the forest itself. He blazed new trails with his ATV, leaving ruts in the moss. He scattered granola wrappers without noticing. He even tried to approach the herd directly one morning, moving too fast, his scent thick on the wind. The horses vanished for days afterward, leaving only nervous tracks and broken grass. Clara's frustration grew, bubbling under her skin until it threatened to boil over. She argued gently, then more forcefully, trying to explain the delicate balance of respect, the necessity of patience. Corbin listened, then ignored her advice. One night, she awoke to the sound of distant shouting, then the unmistakable report of a tranquilizer dart gun. Soft but sharp, unnatural against the quiet. Clara sat up, heart pounding. She pulled on her jacket and boots, grabbed her flashlight, and hurried out into the chilly darkness. She followed the faint glow of headlights and the smell of exhaust to a clearing near the river, where Corbin's ATV sat idling. He stood over a trembling shape on the ground. The silver colt, legs sprawled, eyes wild with terror. A tranquilizer dart stuck out of its flank. Nearby, the matriarch circled, nostrils flared, stomping the earth in rage. "What the hell are you doing?" Clara shouted, anger breaking through her restraint. "You can't just—" "It's just a tracker," Corbin protested, his voice defensive. "This is standard procedure. I had a clean shot, Dawson. This is what science looks like." The herd panicked, crashed through the brush, scattering into the night. The matriarch lunged at Corbin's ATV, her hooves striking the metal with a hollow bang. Corbin leapt aside, cursing. The Mustangs vanished, leaving the silver colt behind, limping, trembling, alone. Clara dropped to her knees beside the colt, hands shaking as she checked its breathing, watching for signs of shock. Corbin hovered over her, still muttering justifications, but she barely heard him. All she could see was fear in the colt's dark eyes, the thin trickle of blood from where the dart had struck. "Go," she said, voice cold. "Just go back to the cabin. I'll deal with this." Corbin hesitated, then stomped away, the undergrowth swallowing his frustration. Alone, Clara stroked the colt's neck, whispering apologies she knew it wouldn't understand. She stayed with it until the sedative wore off, her flashlight burning low, her own tears mingling with the dew on the grass. By sunrise, the colt could stand, but its leg trembled with each step. The herd was nowhere to be seen. Clara walked it as far as the tree line, watching as it disappeared, limping into the shadows. She stood there long after, fists clenched, fury and grief roiling inside her. The balance she had worked so hard to achieve was gone, scattered by one man's arrogance and impatience, the trust of weeks, undone in a single night. But Clara made herself a silent promise as she walked back to the outpost. This was not the end. Not for her. Not for the Mustangs. The outpost was never truly silent again after that night. Even when the wind dropped and the river quieted, there was a tension in the air, a lingering echo of panic that had settled in Clara's chest. The morning after Shane Corbin's reckless tagging, Clara awoke to a world that seemed sharper, colder. Every shadow felt like a threat, every noise a warning. She couldn't shake the image of the silver colt's terrified eyes, the thin line of blood from the tranquilizer dart, the way the herd had scattered like smoke. Claire's anger simmered beneath the surface, but so did something else, a raw, unyielding sorrow. She felt like she'd failed, all those weeks of patient trust undone in a single act of arrogance. Corbin's ambition had shattered the fragile peace she'd built, not just with the Mustangs, but within herself. She wanted to scream, to break something, to run after the herd and apologize for the whole broken world. Instead, she found herself standing at the edge of the clearing where she'd last seen the injured colt. The grass was still flattened where it had lain, and faint hoof prints led away into the trees. Clara knelt, tracing the tracks with shaking hands. She wanted so badly to see the herd gathered nearby, to find the matriarch standing guard, to know that her presence hadn't been a poison. But there was only silence. The Mustangs were gone. Back at the outpost, Clara confronted Corbin. She found him, in the office, hunched over a pile of notes, his phone on speaker, as he dictated a rapid-fire report to someone at headquarters. He barely looked up when she entered, but Clara's presence filled the small room with tension. "You need to report what happened," she said, voice steady but icy. "You went out without authorization. You traumatized an entire herd. You almost crippled that colt." Corbin scowled, waving a hand dismissively. "It was standard procedure. I followed all the protocols for safe tranquilizing. I'll log it in the research notes. You're blowing this out of proportion, Dawson." Clara's fists clenched. "You're not listening. That herd trusted us. That colt—" "Look," Corbin interrupted, irritation finally breaking through his practiced calm. "You're letting your feelings get in the way of the work. I know you care about these animals, but you're not a scientist. We can't just sit back and watch forever. If we want results, we have to take risks." Clara stared at him, disbelief twisting in her gut. "You think I don't know about risk? You think I don't know what it costs to lose something you care about?" Corbin shrugged, unconcerned. "The tag will help us. You'll see. Once the data starts coming in," but Clara was already walking away, unable to listen any longer. She slammed the door behind her, the echo ringing in her ears. For the rest of the day, she barely saw Corbin. He avoided her, sensing the depth of her anger, and retreated to his equipment and paperwork. Clara poured herself into routine, cleaning the outpost, cataloging drone footage, checking and rechecking weather data. But her mind was never far from the forest, from the silent accusation in every empty glade. By dusk, she couldn't bear it any longer. She gathered her field kit, first aid supplies, a canteen, a handful of herbs she'd read about in the old ranger's notebook. She set out on foot, determined to find the silver colt, to do whatever she could for the animal she'd failed to protect. The forest felt different now, tense and watchful. But Clara moved carefully, following the faint trail of hoofprints and broken grass. She thought of the old charcoal sketches in the logging cabin, the ones that spoke of survival, of hope in the face of disaster. She needed to believe that trust, once given, could be rebuilt, even if it took everything she had. After nearly an hour of searching, she heard a faint, shuddering whinny, a sound that was both plea and warning. She followed it, heart thundering, until she found the silver colt alone in a narrow ravine, its flank mottled with dirt, its leg trembling beneath its weight. The matriarch and the rest of the herd were nowhere in sight. Clara kept her distance, kneeling in the grass and laying her supplies out in front of her. She spoke softly, her voice barely more than a breath. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to help." The colt watched her, wide-eyed, ears pinned back. Clara could see the swelling around the tag on its leg, the way it shifted its weight, trying not to put pressure on the injury. She didn't dare approach, not yet. Instead, she placed a shallow bowl of water within reach, along with a small bundle of crushed herbs. She sat down cross-legged, waiting. Night crept in slowly, the sky streaked with bruised purple and gold. Clara stayed, murmuring gentle words, sometimes lapsing into silence. She found herself talking to Mark again, confessing her fears and regrets into the dusk. "I don't know if I can fix this," she whispered, "but I have to try. I can't lose another life to fire, to mistakes." Gradually, the colt edged closer. It sniffed the herbs, nosed the water. Clara kept her hands open, palms up, a gesture of trust she'd learned from weeks of watching. She didn't move when the colt finally sipped, didn't flinch when it snorted in her direction. She just stayed, as steady and quiet as the trees around them. However, in that fragile space between predator and prey, between guilt and forgiveness, something shifted. Clara felt her own heart slow, the anger draining away, replaced by a fierce determination. She would not let Corbin's recklessness define her work. She would not let fear win. Not this time. When the stars came out, Clara gathered her things and rose. She left a fresh poultice of herbs, hoping the colt would find it helpful. Before she left, she whispered again, as if her brother could hear, "Thank you for trusting me, for giving me another chance." Back at the outpost, exhaustion hit her like a wave. She barely noticed Corbin sitting at the kitchen table, eyes darting between her and his notes. She ignored him, washing her hands and scrubbing the dirt from beneath her nails until they hurt. Her whole body ached. But she felt lighter, cleansed by the act of care, by the hope that she might, one day, be forgiven. That night, Clara dreamed not of fire, but of water. A river running fast and clear, the Mustang herd drinking at its banks. Mark stood across the stream, not calling to her, just smiling. For the first time, she woke with something like peace fluttering in her chest. And so, as the days passed, Clara doubled down on her efforts. She checked the ravine each morning, leaving water and fresh herbs, always at a distance, always respectful. She recorded her observations, noting the colt's slow improvement, the first hints of the herd returning to the area, the matriarch's tracks in the mud. The outpost felt less like a prison and more like a place of purpose again. Clara's trust in herself, and in the wild hearts she watched over, began, haltingly, to return. The last weeks of autumn brought a restlessness to the forest, as if every living thing sensed that time was running short. The days grew brief and urgent. Mornings were swallowed by a heavy fog that clung to the ground and lingered until noon. Clara woke each morning with the feeling that something was pressing in on her chest, not just the troubles with Corbin and the Mustang herd, but something larger, older, lurking in the very soil and air. She moved through her routines, tending to the injured colt, charting the herd's cautious return. The wounds, physical and emotional, were slowly healing, but trust, she knew, was as delicate as a spider's thread and just as easy to break. The outpost felt like a place perched on the edge of disaster, balanced on a precipice she couldn't see. Even the sky seemed tense, clouds massing low and dark on the horizon, thick with the promise of rain. Corbin, chastened by Clara's unyielding anger and the silence that had settled between them, kept his distance. He spent his days in the office, crunching data and sending terse updates to headquarters. At night, he stared out the window at the endless forest, the glow of his laptop painting his face in ghostly colors. The two of them spoke little. Their partnership had become a cold ceasefire, punctuated only by necessity. Then, late one afternoon, the storm arrived. It began with a distant grumble, so low Clara felt it more than heard it, a vibration running through the floorboards of the outpost, making her bones ache. She looked up from her notes, watching as the trees outside began to whip in the rising wind. The clouds were nearly black, boiling over the mountain peaks like smoke. She checked the emergency weather alerts, flood warning in effect. The river, already swollen from recent rains, would not be able to hold. She grabbed her rain gear, field radio, and first aid kit, heart thumping. The drone system chirped with an automated alarm, flashing red. Motion detected. River valley. Anomaly detected. Clara's hands trembled as she scrolled through the real-time footage. She saw the herd, scattered, nervous, picking their way along the edge of the floodplain, the matriarch moving urgently, the silver colt limping but keeping up. Then the drone caught another shape, a fallen tree, half blocking the path. Water already lapped at its roots. "Shane," Clara called, urgency overriding their Cold War. "Get the emergency kit. There's a flood coming. I have to get down to the valley. The herd's in trouble." He hesitated only a second before nodding. For all his faults, he knew the dangers of these mountains. He tossed her a rope and flashlight, checking his own radio. "Be careful," he muttered, for once sounding sincere. Clara sprinted through the rain, her boots slipping in the thickening mud. The storm was upon her, rain slicing sideways, stinging her face and soaking her clothes to the skin. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it set the world trembling. She barely noticed, moving with the single-minded intensity of someone who knows that every second counts. By the time she reached the river, it was already a churning, violent torrent, muddy water tearing at the banks. Branches and debris swirled past, colliding with logs and forming makeshift dams. She spotted the matriarch first, trapped by the rising water in a snarl of downed trees. The mare whinnied, eyes wild, hooves churning at the mud as she fought to free herself. The rest of the herd had retreated to higher ground, calling anxiously. The silver colt was there, frantic, pacing back and forth, unable to get close, but unwilling to abandon its guardian. Clara didn't pause to think. She pulled the rope from her pack, tying one end around a sturdy pine and the other around her waist. She waded into the flood, boots braced against the sucking current, rain blurring her vision. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts. For a moment, fear threatened to overtake her. Memories of fire, of loss, of helplessness. But she forced herself to keep moving, to focus on the horse's terror instead of her own. "Easy, girl," she called, voice carrying above the roar. "I'm here. Hold on." The matriarch thrashed, trapped by a fallen log wedged against her chest and neck. Clara fought the current, reaching for the mare's bridleless face, hands slipping in the mud. She could feel the raw strength of the animal, the pounding of its heart, the wildness that connected them both. She wrapped the rope around the log, using her own weight and the leverage of a tree stump to shift it inch by inch. Her muscles burned, every joint screaming. The water rose higher, swirling around Clara's waist. For one dizzying moment she feared she'd be swept away. But the matriarch, sensing freedom, lunged again, hooves splashing. With a final surge of strength, Clara hauled the log clear, the rope biting into her palms. The mare stumbled forward, then paused, eyes locked with Clara's. There was fear there, yes, but also something like trust. The silver colt nickered desperately from the bank. Clara motioned with her hands, urging it to stay put. She unhooked the rope, dragging herself out of the water, her limbs trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. She staggered to the high ground, falling to her knees in the wet grass as the herd slowly regrouped around the matriarch. The rain slackened just enough for Clara to catch her breath. She checked the mare for wounds. Nothing serious, just scrapes and bruises. The colt pressed close, nuzzling its protector, then turned to Clara, snorting softly. For a few long moments they stood together in the battered clearing, human and horses, survivors all. Clara felt something shift inside her, a knot she'd carried since Mark's death loosening just a little. Here, in the heart of chaos, she had not run or hidden. She had chosen to fight, to save, to reach across the gulf between species and offer her strength. As she guided the horses up the hill to safety, Corbin appeared out of the trees, soaked and breathless. He stared in disbelief at what Clara had done. The herd clustered around her like a shield. For the first time since his arrival, he seemed at a loss for words. The forest was battered and bruised, but alive. Clara stood beneath the storm-riven sky, soaked to the bone, her muscles aching, and knew that something important had been rebuilt. Not just trust with the Mustangs, but a trust in herself she thought she'd lost forever. She reached for the old compass, feeling its reassuring weight in her pocket, and whispered, "We made it, Mark. We made it through the flood." Above them, the clouds began to break, shafts of sunlight spearing down, gilding the battered herd and the muddy, triumphant ranger who'd risked everything to save them. The world felt strangely quiet after the storm, a hush that settled over the drenched woods as if even the birds were too tired to sing. The flood had left its mark, branches and mud strewn across the trails, debris caught in the crooks of trees, the riverbank ragged and gouged. Yet, as Clara made her slow way back to the outpost, she felt an unfamiliar sense of peace weaving itself through her exhaustion. It was the peace that follows crisis, that comes from knowing you have done all you could, and maybe, just maybe, change something important. That night, Clara barely slept. Her body ached, her muscles twitching with the memory of cold water and raw effort, but her mind replayed every second by the river. She saw again the wild terror in the matriarch's eyes, the desperate courage of the silver colt, the moment when trust was tested in the floodwaters and against all odds was not found wanting. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft patter of lingering rain. The old compass lay on the nightstand, glinting in the lamplight like a promise she was finally ready to believe. At dawn, Clara brewed coffee and stood on the porch, cradling the mug between her palms. The forest was still damp, every blade of grass tipped with diamonds of dew. The air tasted fresh, the world scoured clean. Somewhere far off, a woodpecker tapped a slow rhythm. She closed her eyes and breathed it all in, the scent of wet earth, the distant sound of rushing water, the pulse of life that was, for a moment, undisturbed by fear or ambition. She thought of the drawing she'd pinned to the tree weeks ago, a sketch of the silver colt, her best yet, left as a gesture of respect. She hadn't checked on it since the storm, too caught up in the rush of survival and the daily labor of trust. Now, with the morning sun breaking through the clouds, she felt a quiet tug at her heart, an urge to return to that sacred space in the woods. Clara gathered her things, notebook, pencil, a fresh piece of paper. She tucked the compass in her pocket, almost without thinking, as natural as breathing. She left a note for Corbin, terse but polite, heading out, checking on the herd, back by noon. He had become almost invisible in recent days, content to let her move through the world on her own terms. She was grateful for the absence of his noise. The hike was longer than she remembered, the path made treacherous by slick mud and the debris left by the flood. But Clara welcomed the challenge. Each step grounded her, reminding her of what it meant to be alive in this wild, unpredictable place. She kept her eyes open for signs of the herd, a patch of gray hair snagged on a bush, fresh hoof prints pressed deep into the soft earth, the faint tang of horses on the breeze. When she reached the familiar clearing, her breath caught in her throat. The tree where she'd pinned her drawing stood undisturbed, its bark darkened by rain. But the sketch was gone. In its place, nestled within a neat circle of stones that had not been there before, was the compass. Her compass. The one she'd lost during the flood, swept away by the raging river as she fought to free the matriarch. Clara stared, disbelieving. She knelt beside the stones, her fingers trembling as she picked up the compass. It was muddy and scratched, but intact. She turned it over in her hand, marveling at the impossible. How could it have ended up here, so far from the river, so perfectly placed at the heart of the herd's gathering ground? It felt like a message, a wordless answer to all the questions she had shouted at the sky in sleepless nights. Trust given, trust returned. Her eyes prickled with tears, but she wiped them away with the back of her hand. This was no time for self-pity. She looked around, searching for any sign of the Mustangs. At first, there was only silence, the kind of silence that rings in the ears, vast and full. Then she heard it, the soft, heavy breath of a horse, the gentle clop of a hoof on stone. The matriarch appeared at the edge of the clearing, the silver colt close behind. They stopped, watching her with eyes as dark and deep as the forest itself. Clara stayed perfectly still, heart pounding. The horses didn't come closer, but they didn't flee. They simply stood, present, acknowledging her presence with the easy dignity of the truly wild. Slowly, Clara sat back on her heels, setting the compass in her lap. She pulled out her notebook and began to sketch, not just the horses, but the scene itself. The circle of stones, the dappled light, the fragile peace that had settled over them all. She drew the matriarch's scars, the proud line of her neck, the colt's wary curiosity. She drew herself, small and humble, a part of the landscape rather than an intruder. The hours slipped away. At some point, the herd melted back into the trees, moving with the quiet grace of creatures who owe nothing to anyone. Clara stayed in the clearing long after, her sketches piling up in her lap. She thought of Mark, how he'd always said that real connection wasn't about possession or control, but about respect, about being willing to wait, to listen, to accept what is freely offered, and nothing more. Before leaving, Clara gathered her sketches and left a new one in the wooden box she'd found in the old logging cabin, a portrait of the matriarch and the silver colt side by side, strong and unbroken. It was, she hoped, a gift to whoever came after her, a message written in pencil and patience. You are not alone. Even out here, among ghosts and wild hearts, there is a circle you can belong to if you have the courage to wait for the invitation. With the compass tucked safely in her jacket, Clara walked back through the woods, her steps lighter than they'd been in months. The forest seemed to open for her, letting her pass without resistance. The air buzzed with life, the promise of winter held at bay for just a little while longer. When she returned to the outpost, Corbin was there, fiddling with the drone equipment. He looked up, startled by the change in her. For the first time, Clara smiled, soft but sure. She felt changed, and the world, impossibly, felt kinder. She didn't need to explain what had happened. Some things were better left unsaid, silent gestures that spoke louder than words ever could. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in strokes of lavender and gold, Clara stood outside and watched the darkness gather. She pressed the compass to her heart and whispered, "Thank you." Not just to the Mustangs, or to her brother's memory, but to the wildness itself, to everything that had broken her open and against all odds let her heal. The first snow came early that year, sifting down through the high branches and dusting the world in delicate white. For Clara, it felt like a gentle blessing, a way for the forest to cover the wounds of autumn, to signal a new beginning. The land was quieter now. Birdsong faded with the shortening days, and the river, once swollen and wild, ran slow and clear, bordered by ice. There was a hush to everything, as if the earth itself was pausing to breathe. After the storm, After the silent exchange in the clearing, life at the outpost moved with a different rhythm. Clara felt it in her bones. She had crossed a threshold, stepped into a new season, not only in the mountains, but in her own heart. The Mustang herd had returned to their familiar territory. The matriarch, dignified and unbowed, led them along the ridges, the silver colt, still limping slightly, but growing stronger, never far from her side. The other horses, emboldened by safety, foraged in the meadows. They did not flee at Clara's approach now. Instead, they watched her with calm, dark eyes, measuring her intentions but no longer afraid. Corbin, for his part, had changed too. Perhaps it was the storm or the quiet authority Clara had gained, but he no longer prowled the outpost with restless energy. He spent more time behind the drone screens, compiling reports and reviewing footage. He barely mentioned tagging or tracking callers, and when he did, it was with a new note of humility. Headquarters, after a brief flurry of concern over the flood damage and Corbin's unauthorized tagging, shifted their attention to other projects. There would be no reinforcements, no new equipment, just Clara, Corbin, and the winter coming on. But the breach of trust could not be left unaddressed. One morning, as frost coated the porch and the world shimmered in the pale sun, Clara typed up her report for the agency's ethics board. She wrote plainly about Corbin's unauthorized tranquilization, about the injury to the colt, about the disruption to the herd. She did not add bitterness, only facts and observations, her tone measured but firm. She attached drone footage of the incident, along with her field notes and the recovery of the colt. A week later, a message crackled through the radio. Corbin was to be removed from the site. His contract ended, his behavior under review. There was no drama in his leaving. He packed in silence, tension curling around his movements, pausing only once in the kitchen to look Clara in the eyes. "I was wrong," he said quietly, his voice stripped of bravado, "about a lot of things. You're a better ranger than I'll ever be." He hesitated, then added, "Take care of the Sim, will you?" Clara only nodded. She watched as the SUV disappeared down the mountain road, a thin line of dust marking Corbin's passage. For a long moment she stood on the porch, letting the emptiness settle, feeling the balance return to the world. She was alone again, but it was not the same kind of loneliness. It felt more like peace. Winter deepened, painting the landscape in soft grays and blues. Clara's routine slowed with the season. She spent hours watching the herd, sometimes hiking for miles just to catch a glimpse of the silver colt bounding through drifts, sometimes pausing at the edge of the woods to watch the matriarch lead her family beneath the heavy sky. Every day, she carried the compass in her pocket, its reassuring weight, a reminder of where she'd been and how far she'd come. One afternoon, Clara visited the old logging cabin. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and the musty smell of damp wood mingled with the icy air. On the walls, the charcoal sketches had faded a little, but their wild energy remained. Horses running, leaping, surviving. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and sketched a new image. The entire herd gathered in a tight circle. The matriarch and silver colt at the center, a ring of strength and protection. She slipped the drawing into a wooden box beneath the cot, next to the note she'd left before. For the next ranger, she wrote on the back, "For anyone who comes here and feels lost." The days lengthened, and with them came a sense of closure. News of Clara's rescue during the flood, captured by the outpost's drones, quietly spread through conservation circles. The video, grainy but gripping, showed Clara risking everything for the Mustangs, her actions a stark contrast to the heavy-handed tactics so often used with wild animals. Researchers from other states called for advice. Headquarters sent a terse commendation, tucked between budget reports and weather warnings, but none of that mattered much to Clara. She'd found something in the wilderness more valuable than praise or promotion. She'd found forgiveness, not only from the herd, but from herself. She could feel it each time she sat in the cold grass, sketching the Mustangs as they moved like living ghosts through the trees. She could feel it each time she whispered to the wind, knowing her brother's memory was now something that could rest gently within her, rather than burn. One day, near sunset, Clara sat at the edge of the clearing where she had first seen the silver colt. The forest was awash with golden light. The mustangs grazed nearby, unconcerned by her presence. She watched the colt, now almost grown, run a short distance and rear up, kicking at the air with strength she hadn't seen before. The matriarch stood nearby, and for just a moment their eyes met Clara's across the cold, clean space. "Thank you," Clara thought. "Thank you for letting me be here." She stood, brushing snow from her jeans, and made her way back to the outpost. The path was familiar now, the shadows comforting. In the distance, a coyote howled, and she smiled, feeling a kinship with the wild, solitary creatures of the forest. Before bed, Clara lit a small fire in the stove and opened her notebook, reading over the sketches and notes from the past months. The story they told was one of pain and healing, of solitude and unexpected community, of loss and acceptance. It was, she realized, the story of a circle completed. What was broken had not only been mended, but had become something new. Clara set the compass on the windowsill, where the light of the moon could catch it, and finally allowed herself to rest. The circle of trust, between her and the herd, between her present and her past, was not a cage, but an open ring. Not about possession or control, but about presence, patience, and respect. In the cold hush of the Montana night, as snow drifted down in silver silence, Clara Dawson finally found what she had been searching for, not just peace, but belonging. Winter crept over the mountains, laying its cold, shimmering quilt over every hollow and ridge. The outpost huddled in the forest's embrace, smoke curling from its chimney as Clara Dawson settled into the rhythm of the season. Gone was the relentless ache that had shadowed her since the fire. In its place, a quiet clarity, a sense of having crossed through fire and flood, grief and forgiveness, and emerged on the other side changed. Snow gathered on the porch railings, muffling the world until it seemed she lived on the edge of the earth. In the stillness, Clara discovered a kind of peace she'd never known. A comfort in her own company, in the pulse of life around her. She learned the stories written in the patterns of animal tracks, the subtle shifts in wind that signaled changing weather, the way each day brought its own lesson in humility. The Mustangs weathered the seasons with their characteristic resilience. The matriarch led her herd through snowdrifts, always finding the safest trails, the best patches of winter grass. The silver colt, no longer quite a colt, moved with a sureness born of survival, his limp fading as the weeks passed, his coat thick and gleaming in the brittle sunlight. Clara watched them from a respectful distance, never approaching too close, never pushing the boundary that now existed in easy balance. Sometimes, if she was especially quiet, she could hear their breath in the frozen air, see the flick of their tails and the spark of wildness in their eyes. Her daily routines became rituals. She filled the bird feeders, shoveled snow from the path to the generator shed, and checked the drone system, its memory full of footage from quieter days. Each evening, as dusk fell, she sat by the window with a cup of coffee, sketchbook in hand, and watched the light bleed from the world, painting the snow in lavender and blue. Sometimes Clara wondered what Mark would say if he could see her now. She imagined him, legs kicked up by the stove, grinning as he teased her for growing soft out here with the wild things. But when she looked at the compass, always within reach on the table, she felt only gratitude, a warmth that lingered long after the fire's embers died. The isolation no longer pressed on her like a burden. Instead, she felt a kinship with the place and its creatures, a knowledge that she was a part of this landscape, no longer a visitor, but a thread woven through its tapestry. The Mustangs were not hers, and never would be. But in learning to respect their distance, in accepting their presence without expectation, Clara found a deeper connection than any she'd forced in her former life. As spring edged into the valley, first as a trickle of meltwater, then a burst of green beneath the snow, word came from headquarters her contract would be renewed for another year, if she wanted it. There was talk of more grants, of using her notes and footage to teach best practices to other rangers and researchers. Clara sent a polite reply, grateful for the support but unmoved by the hint of acclaim. She no longer needed validation from distant offices or scientific journals. One morning, as frost glimmered on the grass and the air carried the promise of thaw, Clara set out to visit the old logging cabin. She carried with her a bundle of sketches, drawings of the herd in every season. The matriarch standing watch, the silver colt racing through fresh powder, the circle of stones where her compass had been returned. The trail was familiar, her boots finding every dip and rise without thought. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than she remembered, as if the ghosts of those who'd come before had made space for her at last. She opened the wooden box beneath the cot, adding her latest drawing, a portrait of the entire herd, wild and strong beneath a Montana sky. On the back she wrote, "For those who come after, may you find what you seek in these woods. May you remember that trust is a gift, never a right." Leaving the cabin, Clara paused on the threshold and looked back at the sketches on the wall. Faded but indelible, she realized she had become part of the story. One more caretaker in a long line. A steward of the fragile trust between human and wild. Back at the outpost, spring quickened. Birds returned in flocks, calling to one another in the dawn light. Small flowers pushed up through melting snow, bright patches of hope in the brown earth. The Mustang herd ranged higher on the ridges, moving with confidence as the silver colt, now tall, muscled, and bold, ran alongside the matriarch, their shadows flickering on the new grass. One day, as Clara watched from the shelter of a spruce, the silver Mustang turned, and just for a heartbeat, met her gaze. They regarded each other across the distance, neither captive nor captor, but equals joined by shared history and mutual respect. The horse tossed its head, mane catching the sunlight, and then galloped away, leaving a trail of prints in the soft earth. Clara smiled. She understood now that healing is not about forgetting, but about making space for pain and hope to live side by side. As she thought of the compass, how its needle always found north, even when she felt lost. She thought of her brother, her grief, and how both had shaped her, not into something broken, but into someone brave enough to start again. That night, as the sky filled with stars and the forest pulsed with life, Clara wrote in her journal for the last time that season. True connection isn't about control. It's about presence, patience, and respect. About letting others come close on their own terms. The wild will never belong to me. And that's the beauty of it. As she closed her notebook, Clara felt the circle complete. She belonged. To the forest, to the present, to herself. She had found her place among wild hearts. And as the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of rain and freedom, Clara Dawson finally let herself rest, not alone, but home.